Society of America, and it's wonderful to have you with us today in San Francisco's Chinatown, the nation's oldest, for a very special afternoon. At CHSA, we're dedicated to preserving and sharing the rich and complex stories of Chinese Americans. We do this through exhibitions, education, public programs, and gatherings like today, spaces where conversation and community come together. Today, we welcome Michael, not just as an acclaimed journalist, but as a fellow Chinese American deeply engaged in telling our story. It's my pleasure to introduce our distinguished guest, Michael Luo. Michael is the executive editor of The New Yorker, where he writes on politics, race, religion, and media with insight and moral clarity. Before joining The New Yorker, he spent over a decade at The New York Times, reporting on everything from immigration to economic justice, earning prestigious awards including the George Polk and the Livingston. Michael's powerful new book, you can hold it up for everyone if you don't have it, please. Strangers in the Land, Exclusion, Belonging, and the Epic Story of Chinese in America is a monumental contribution, one that brings to life the struggles, achievements, and resilience of our communities across generations. It's a story that speaks to our past, but also resonates deeply today. Joining Michael in conversation is Isaac Chotiner, a brilliant journalist and interviewer known for his incisive style and thoughtful approach. Isaac, did he frown at me?
No.
Isaac is a staff writer at The New Yorker and the principal contributor to the magazine's Q&A series, one of the most widely read and talked about interview columns in contemporary journalism. Through his persistence and nuanced questioning, he has drawn out illuminating insights from a wide range of public figures across politics, literature, and culture. Before his time at The New Yorker, Isaac was a staff writer at Slate and served as senior editor at The New Republic. His writing has also appeared in The New York Times, The Atlantic, and The Washington Post. A graduate of UC Davis, Isaac brings a Northern California perspective to his national reporting. Please join me in welcoming both Michael and Isaac as they begin their conversation.
Thank you for having us here. I'm really glad to be here, and I just want to say how wonderful this book is. I hope everyone picks up a copy. I say this as someone with credibility since Mike is my boss. But
I do his annual evaluations.
yeah, exactly. But no, it's a really, really terrific book, and I can't wait to talk about it with you. So thank you for coming.
I'm ready to be Chotiner,
No.
Isaac.
I want to start here, which is just a very basic question, which is, and maybe you can touch on the fact that we just heard that we're in the oldest Chinatown in America, which I didn't realize this when I picked up the book, that it's also a California story in a lot of ways too. So just tell us why you embarked on this book and what history you were trying to tell.
So I can answer that question in a personal way, I think, first. You know, I talk about this in the book's introduction, and in the fall of 2016, I had an encounter along with the rest of my family that, you know, I think is probably familiar to other Asian Americans. But it was a kind of a particular set of circumstances here. It was October. It's a couple of weeks away from Trump's election. You could feel this kind of curtain of nativism kind of descending on the country. And a group of my friends and my family were on the sidewalk on the Upper East Side, and a woman, well-dressed woman, I went back and read this piece I wrote about this, and she had an iPhone 6 Plus, I noticed. That's what says a little bit about her in that time. She brushed past us because she was annoyed that we were blocking the sidewalk, and she muttered as she was pushing past, "Go back to China." And you know, it was a Sunday after church, but I didn't turn the other cheek. Sadly, I abandoned my daughter in her stroller, and I kind of sprinted down the sidewalk, and basically confronted her, and I was like, you know, really, is that, and we kind of had this exchange. We were yelling back and forth, and then she yelled, "Go back to your effing country," and I just remember this kind of the adrenaline, and I had this trying to think of something smart to say back, and I said, "I was born in this country," and it just felt so pathetic. And what happened was I went back to the restaurant, and I kind of live tweeted about it, and I used the hashtag "This is 2016" with
Closer to your mouth.
closer to my mouth, like this, like this. Basically, just I used the hashtag "This is 2016" because I was kind of remarking about how it was 2016 and we're still kind of dealing with this kind of thing. And this tweet, the series of tweets that I did on it, kind of went viral, and Bill de Blasio tweeted back at me, the mayor of New York, and I ended up writing a piece for the. Oh, you want me to switch microphones? Oh, that's better. I ended up writing a piece, an open letter to this woman about my feelings about what happened this moment. And I wrote about this kind of persistent feeling of otherness that a lot of Asian Americans feel, and I wrote about this kind of, I guess this kind of sadness that I felt as I was walking home and pushing my daughter in her stroller, and I was just thinking about wondering whether my kids, who are 2 generations removed from the immigrant experience of my parents, would ever feel like they truly belong in this country. So this was 2016. Obviously, I didn't write the book at that point. I was still at the New York Times at that point. New York Times published this piece on the front page of the newspaper, and it became like this viral sort of conversation item in the Asian American community. And what stuck with me, though, at that moment, you know, I was kind of briefly, I joke about this, I was kind of like the face of Asian America for a while. I was like on MSNBC, I was doing all these panels, and the thing about it was I realized, though, I was just this person that had had this experience happen to me. But this history, this history that I write about in this book, I actually wasn't familiar with it. It was something I knew a little bit about, enough to kind of talk a little bit about, but it wasn't, I guess I kind of felt like, to a certain extent, because my story is the post-1965 story, and this story that's in this book is a previous migration, and it felt kind of distant. And so, but I felt like I felt this kind of need to know more about it. And so I set that aside. 2021 comes around, the pandemic, and you know, the Atlanta spa attacks happened. There was that kind of surge in attention around anti-Asian violence, and I ended up writing a piece for the New Yorker about some of this history. And I drew on a few books. It's important to know that I'm not the first to write this history. Iris Chang wrote this book called The Chinese America. That was one of the books I drew on. Beth Lou Williams, who's an academic at Princeton, wrote a book called The Chinese Must Go. Gene Failser wrote a book called Driven Out. Anyways, I wrote this book, this history, and what I realized writing that essay was that how relevant that stuff felt to the current moment. That this kind of exclusionary past that I talk about in this book is really kind of part of our exclusionary present. And in order to understand this kind of present, you have to go back.
So for people that may not have read the book or don't know this history, this is really a history largely of the second half of the 19th century. So can you talk a little bit about when the first Chinese Americans came and why, you know, maybe get also into why it's in large part a California story?
Yeah, I mean, it starts with the gold rush. One of the things when I was writing the early chapters is I had this kind of desire to figure out, like, was there like a kind of a patient zero, like the first person who came, the kind of mystery of how it was that there was this giant migration from this parcel of land, really like kind of the size of Connecticut in southeastern China. And one of the interesting anecdotes that's in the book is there's kind of like a story, maybe it's apocryphal, that was passed down in the Chinese community about a merchant named Cheng Yum who apparently, reportedly was here in 1847. The reason why I'm saying it might be apocryphal is that would have been really, really early for a Chinese merchant to be here. But the story that as it was passed down in the Chinese community was that this guy was among the legions who went into the foothills of the Sierra Nevada for the gold rush. He wrote a letter home, and it was a fellow villager who received this letter, told other people about it, and set off across the Pacific itself. That might not be exactly what happened, but it's an incredible story. But basically the gold rush brought to California this unprecedented global migration from, Irish Americans, German Americans, Scotch Americans, immigrants. There were white Americans from the East Coast. There were indigenous people. There were Californios who were the Mexican, they're the Spanish-speaking settlers here. There were black Americans. It was basically, and there were Chinese. And this was a experiment in multiracial democracy that was unprecedented for our country up to that point. And my book tells the story of how we, America, reacted to this influx of people, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people from a distant land who spoke a different language, who looked different, didn't fit into the racial hierarchy that existed in America, and what happened.
I'm hoping you can talk a little bit about one of the most interesting things I thought about the book was kind of the political cleavages that developed as more Chinese Americans were coming in. And some of them are, some parallels with our own day, but some of them are kind of unique. But so I'm curious if you can sort of sketch that for people, because obviously this influx of people causes all kinds of societal and political reactions.
Yeah. So the really interesting thing is this immigration, the Chinese immigration that really started to cause this rising levels of resentment and tension was primarily a West Coast phenomenon. On the East Coast, New York City, where there's a big Chinatown, really didn't get started until post-1870s, like 1880-ish. And so there is the question, so the Chinese, what is known today as the Chinese Exclusion Act passed in 1882. And so how did this kind of West Coast phenomenon become a national law? And how did it kind of become this national consensus? And it is really related to how closely polarized the country was at that point, which is really resonant with the current moment. Democrats, who were their stronghold was the post-Reconstruction South. Republicans, this is the party of Lincoln that eradicated slavery, stood for these principles of liberty and equality. How was it that the Republican Party came to be just as vitriolic about immigrants as the Democratic Party? And it really relates to the search for political advantage. They were basically evenly divided, and it was the West Coast that both parties were looking to for advantage. They needed California, Washington, Nevada, and that would determine control of Congress, the presidency, they were looking for a scapegoat. And this is kind of how the anti-Chinese movement became kind of a national consensus, because they were looking for this political advantage, which is really resonant with today and the kind of polarized politics that we're in. And the reality is both parties at this point are, to a certain extent, obviously one party more than the other, but to a certain extent, both parties are scapegoating immigrants at this point.
One theme that's kind of overlaying the book is that as the Civil War happens, you have these changing conceptions of citizenship within the United States. But at the same time, at least my reading of your book was that in some ways the story as it goes from 1850 to the 1880s, which is the Civil War and post-Civil War period, pre-Civil War, post-Civil War period, in some ways it becomes a darker story, even as you have these new conceptions of citizenship after the Civil War, which I thought was an interesting tension. Was that your reading too, and how do you understand that sort of paradox?
Yeah, because it's interesting because the word citizen appears many times in the Constitution. It was never fully defined, and it was the Civil War and after the Civil War that you had to define what a citizen was, and there was this there's a chapter in my book devoted to the debate in 1870 when William Sumner, this kind of firebrand radical Republican senator from Massachusetts, wanted to abolish he wanted to allow non-white people to become citizens. In 1790, there was a law that governs naturalization that reserves it for white residents of good moral character, and so in that debate, it was this extraordinary debate on the Senate floor. Eventually, people of African descent were allowed to naturalization, but the Chinese were a step too far, and so there's this. There's just really interesting arguments over, it related to the language of invasion and these people who could not assimilate with us, and the threat to Anglo-Saxon civilization, and all of this kind of ugly definitions, and yes, you could use the term. I don't like to use the term white supremacy because I feel like sometimes it can be kind of misused and kind of overused, and it's kind of lost its meaning. But that is you can't miss that through line through this moment. I mean, all this stuff was happening at the same time. The vanquishing of Reconstruction, eradication of native peoples, on the Western lands, and Chinese exclusion. This was all happening at the same time, and it's important, and scholars are starting to do that to take all of these multiple forces together and consider them together in the formation of the American Republic.
One thing maybe we should talk more about, just to sort of set the stage more, is how much big business wanted labor in this period, which caused a lot of backlash. Because we've sort of been talking about the ways in which Chinese Americans were not wanted, but there was a very fundamental reason that many stakeholders in American society in the second half of the 19th century did want them here. So maybe you can talk about that, with also some parallels to today, I would say.
Yeah, totally. It's important to remember that Chinese migration really started to surge after the Burlingame Treaty, which passed in 1868, and that kind of established this right of free migration between China and the United States. And the forces behind that included people who kind of business people who envisioned this kind of golden age of trade with China. It also included, honestly, Christians. This desire to evangelize the Far East, and so there was this kind of it's almost like a kind of an elite class of American society and politicians who favored Chinese immigration in this way, and Yeah, so, and the backlash, the anti-Chinese movement, Dennis Carney, who is this kind of demagogue-like figure, who's kind of a labor leader, he started this working men's party, and it was at its root an anti-Chinese party, but it was also an anti-corporate party. It was an anti-sort of corporate power sort of party. And so you see some of those same populist themes happening with the MAGA movement today.
Yeah, one of the things I thought was really interesting about the book was some of these business leaders are, sort of come across as the least racist people in the book at times, but at the same time are...
Only to a certain extent.
Yeah, well, it's a sliding scale, yeah.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you can imagine how, not just imagine what you talk about, how they're treating their workers and so on and so forth. So it is a complex story.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I mean, the other place where you see this obviously is with the railroad, and when you read the letters of the Big Four who led the Central Pacific, and they at first they were skeptical of the Chinese and whether they could carry out these tasks and swing these sledgehammers and build this railroad, and then and then they're sort of championing of the Chinese and bring them tens of thousands, millions over, but that that kind of goodwill towards the Chinese, that there was this kind of brief window after at the end of the railroad where it might have been possible for Chinese to be welcome, but there was an economic depression that set in, and that kind of 1870s period where it was called the Great Depression, before today's the modern 1930s Great Depression that we know. That was where really the anti-Chinese movement just really accelerated, and yes, there was this kind of conservative class of business leaders who were kind of opposed to the kind of chaos that came from the ugliest kind of most vitriolic anti-Chinese groups, but they were really wanted to just kind of preserve law and order, and most of the time publicly, they also, if you push them, they said, oh, I don't really think the Chinese should be here either, and I don't think they can really assimilate with our people either. And so they were their champions to a certain extent.
You mentioned the word assimilation earlier, and the title of the book is taken from a court decision by Stephen Field, I think was his name.
Justice Stephen Field. Yes.
Justice Stephen Field, Supreme Court decision, which I think the decision itself actually uses the word assimilation and concern that assimilation could not occur with Chinese Americans. And I'm curious how you saw the panic, or how you see the panic of that era with concerns today specifically about assimilation. What was it about Chinese Americans that people were focusing on? It's interesting to read sort of bigotry of previous eras and to then sort of see our own era and see how people talk about the supposed inability of different groups to become part of American society.
Well, the epigraph to my book, I'm going to answer your question in a slightly roundabout way. The epigraph to my book is taken from a book called Interior Chinatown by Charles Yu, which won the National Book Award in 2020. Highly recommend the book. The premise of the book is it's like this really imaginative book where it's the main character is a character actor in a police procedural about a black cop and a white cop, and he is generic Asian man. That's his role, and his greatest aspiration in the show and in life is to become Kung Fu guy. That's like his the best that he could do, basically, as you can tell, it's an indictment of the way race in America is often solely viewed through this lens of black and white. And there's this scene where he's kind of litigating his case, and he's kind of in a fake kind of imaginary courtroom, and he says, who gets to be an American? That is the question. And the epigraph in my book is that question, who gets to be an American? And he goes on and he says, like, we keep falling out of the story. even though we've been here over 150 years. And that's really why I wrote the book, because we keep falling out of the story. And that question of who gets to be an American is the one that's the eternal question. That's what Stephen Field was alluding to when he called the Chinese strangers in the land, and he kind of said that this is a group that couldn't assimilate with our population, the Anglo-Saxon population. And even today, I feel like that is what's going on, is, do these people who, in the 19th century, it was the Chinese. They were the strangers in the land. Today, it's people from Guatemala, El Salvador. It's, around the world, Muslim Americans. There's different groups who are strangers, and, what I say in the book's introduction is, this isn't just the story of the Chinese in America, it's the story of any number of immigrant groups who have been treated as strangers. It's the story of our diverse democracy. It's the story of us.
One area where people might associate with assimilation just because of the intent is converting people to Christianity, and there are a number of Christian characters in this book. And,
a lot of Christian characters.
A lot of Christian characters,
yeah.
and you yourself are a religious person, as you've written about before. I don't think I'm giving anything away. And I'm curious what you made of these religious figures in the book, who, many of them are very noble and well-meaning, but I'm curious what, going back to this era, made you think about that.
Yeah, so, just for folks to be aware, it's really interesting that there's a lot of Christian characters in the book, both white and Chinese. There were, and it's because a lot of churches sent missionaries and pastors to evangelize the Chinese, and it's a lot of those archives still exist. Like, one of the most fascinating archive trips for me doing this book was to Philadelphia, and the Presbyterian Historical Society of America is in Philadelphia. You go there, and there are boxes of letters from the 1870s that are yellowing and crumbling, and like literally, like some of them were like crumbling in my hands as I was going through them. And these were letters that were written from missionaries from the West Coast back to the mission board to tell them about what was going on, and and so yes, and then the other reason that there are many Chinese characters who are Christians is whose archives survive. There aren't very many. It's very hard. You have to look hard for Chinese voices in the archives. They're there. Anytime, and that's the thing. One of the things I'm most proud of the book is, like, anytime I found a character in a newspaper story, in a memoir, I just glommed onto that and just really tried to build out the story of each of these people, because I really felt like it was so important to be able to say their names and to know their stories. And some of the stories that survive are people who spoke English, and they learned English from these churches that held English classes for Chinese. I guess what I'll say is, some of these pastors, William Spear is a good example. He was like this early champion of the Chinese, and a heroic figure in a lot of ways, but also capable of, when referring to the Chinese, spoke in ugly ways, talked about their heathenism, and blamed their character on this heathenism. Another guy, Otis Gibson, who was a Methodist pastor who was incredibly courageous in the face of anti-Chinese sentiment and standing up for the Chinese. He became obsessed with Chinese prostitution, and in that process, kind of, with other anti-Chinese forces, ended up with the passage of the Page Act, which is a really important early anti-Chinese law that was a prelude to Chinese exclusion. What I'll say is that the church is human, and multiple things can be true at once. Good and bad things, and that's what I saw in these archives.
In a few minutes, we're going to be taking questions. They're going to be going around with microphones, so if people have questions or thinking about them, please do. The other institution I was going to ask you about was the media and how it responded. You have a couple of very amusing, darkly amusing quotes, including a horrific quote from a San Francisco Chronicle reporter talking about a Mongolian octopus wrapping its tentacles around the city and so on and so forth. But what was kind of the media response to, what were you able to find in terms of how the media was presenting the story of Chinese Americans or Chinese people coming to America to their readers at the time? Yeah,
I guess I'll say two things about the media. Is one, I'm incredibly grateful to the media that, it's a remarkable thing. Every writer who has written this history comes at it at a different moment, different context. I'm coming at this from post-pandemic and post anti-Asian violence. I'm writing about it, and that really shapes the framing of my storytelling. But I'm basically, I think, the first to write this history benefited from digitization. So many newspapers now are digitized. Newspapers.com, genealogybank.com. There are all these websites. There's a collection of California newspapers that's incredibly valuable. And then in the pandemic, institutions of higher education, universities got really good at digitizing their archives. And so, yes, I did go to the Presbyterian Historical Society of America, go through these boxes of documents, but I also, in some cases, I remember there was an archive at the University of Minnesota, and I was contemplating on whether I'd have to fly to University of Minnesota and go through these boxes, and they're like, you pay us $900, we'll digitize the whole thing. And I was like, okay, sold. And so it's amazing that, like, from my desktop, I can just be paging through right now with newspapers from, 1871, when that just pops to mind because there's the Los Angeles Chinese Massacre of 1871, the worst mass lynching in American history. My file of newspaper articles that allowed me to kind of tell that story in such detail had like 200, 300, articles in it, and so I was really lucky to have these details. But
it's a very diplomatic answer about dead journalists.
Yes, they referred to the Chinese in really ugly ways, and celebrated these. I remember the kicker to my chapter on the Tacoma driving out. In 1885 to 1886, nearly 200 communities in the American West, the residents of those communities drove out their Chinese neighbors, expelled them. Tacoma was one of the most heavily documented and ugly episodes, and the newspaper in Tacoma, I can't remember if it was the Daily Ledger or the Daily News, they just celebrate the next day that the Chinese are gone, and there are no more Chinese in Tacoma, and that reporter who referred to the Mongolian octopus, that was the reporter. It was in 1868, San Francisco Chronicle. He set out to investigate how the Mongolian octopus had fastened its tentacles around the city. So he went down to one of the mutual aid associations, and he asked them, how did this happen? How did it start? And they told him the story about Cheng Yung, the one that I told you about, this guy who was here in 1847. So that story, I got it from that article. And so I benefited from, this reporter who, had a, very ugly attitude towards the Chinese, but I'm able to transform that for a different purpose for today.
People are going to be grateful for Fox News in 125 years. Just a couple more things.
That's a good,
yeah, no, it's interesting to think about that, actually.
Got to think about that one.
At the very end of the book, you say something about Chinese bigotry, anti-Chinese bigotry today. And what I wanted to ask you was, I know you've said a couple times, and you say in the book, that this isn't just the story of the Chinese in America, this is the story of America and history and American democracy and so on. But just to focus specifically on anti-Chinese bigotry, how does it feel different to you than it did then? What is different, and given where you started our conversation today, how do you think about that?
Yeah. So I think it's I said this before about the church. I said multiple things can be true at once. I'm a product of the post-1965 immigration law, which prioritized people with particular skills. My parents came, my dad was a PhD in engineering, my mom got a master's degree in accounting. There's no doubt that there are a lot of Asian Americans, Asian immigrants who are very high achieving. And it's a direct result of the way our immigration system has prioritized that. Yet, it masks, the Asian Americans have the greatest income inequality among any ethnic or racial group. Yet, this feeling of otherness persists undeniably. I'm the executive editor of The New Yorker, yet I still feel sometimes this question of belonging, and do I truly belong here? Do I get to be considered an American? It's the thing that when these conversations, I've been in these spaces, and I think there's such an outpouring of emotion. Because the biggest thing I think Asian Americans are struggling with is invisibility, and this kind of feeling of this history is not known, that the image that's out there is of the model minority, and like when you're thinking about a diverse workplace or a diverse university, Asian Americans don't count. And so when you're in these kinds of spaces, there is a tendency for all of that, to pour out, and I think that's valuable and healthy. At the same time, I don't want it to, like I said, multiple things can be true at once, and it's important to kind of hold, all of that together. I think in thinking about gradations of victimhood and where kind of these feelings of kind of alienation cross over into kind of systemic barriers, that's complicated, but where I start is this question of making these stories known, and and that's what I was trying to do in this book is the word I use in the book is precarity. I think the precarity of the Asian American experience has not subsided. And that precarity means that you could be, riding high and living, your life. You're a successful executive. We have senators. We have, people in running important institutions, and yet the pandemic could happen. This kind of right now we're in a moment when China is an economic juggernaut, a national security perceived as a national security threat. Both parties, to be honest, are kind of equally. It's kind of in vogue to be kind of bellicose about the threat posed by communist China. And as that language, and my parents are, my parents fled mainland China. They were, when the communists came and went to Taiwan. My dad's dad, my grandfather, was a Kuomintang general and was involved in a kind of this final battle between the communists and the nationalists in Yunnan province and was killed. He disappeared. We presume he was killed by the communists. So I understand, the fear and the threat. And yet, when that language ratchets upward, I feel a tremor inside of me. I feel the kind of tinder of racial suspicion rising every time that language is invoked.
Do we have any questions from the audience that people would like to ask now?
So I've got, yeah.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yes. The incident in question,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think it's on.
just speak up.
Yeah.
Hello?
Yeah.
You made reference to the incident in 2016
Yeah.
that started you off on this journey.
Yeah.
Okay. A remarkable journey. And I was prepared, that was about 50 years following the final, the Chinese Exclusion
Right,
Act,
1965. Yeah.
being swept aside
Yeah.
by President
Lyndon Johnson. Yeah.
Lyndon Johnson. And so during those 50 years, I guess you answered my question in part. I was wondering, where were your parents, but more so, not where were they,
Mm-hmm.
but how did they relate to you about what it is to be an American? And not only that, because they could always read from some book
Mm-hmm.
what it is to be an American,
Mm-hmm.
okay?
Yeah.
But particularly, what is it to be
Right.
a Chinese American?
Right.
How, I would like to assume
Right.
that if they had those opportunities while you were growing up,
Yeah.
you would have been prepared in a different way.
Yeah.
And maybe this incident would have not fazed you. So how do you relate to your children in terms of
Yeah.
preparing them
Yeah. Right.
what it is to be a Chinese American?
Right. Multi-part question. One thing I'll say is that's important to know, and we didn't get a chance to talk about, Isaac, is the 1965 law was passed in large measure because the proponents of the law didn't believe that it was going to change the demographics in the country. Lyndon Johnson picked this up from JFK. JFK wanted to reform this kind of quota system that was governing our immigration system. He always felt it was unfair. He was assassinated. Lyndon Johnson took it up. But the thing that they didn't understand, basically their rationale, when you read the debates in the committees, the proponents of the bill just said, they kind of believe, okay, there are a certain number of German Americans, there are a certain number of Irish Americans, there are a certain number of all these different places. They're going to bring over family members, and the demographics of the country are going to be the same. They lost track of the exponential power of family reunification, and that's what's many members of my family came to the United States, and multiply that a million times, and so it was almost an accident, really, that the floodgates were opened, and that's really important for understanding where we are today. In terms of whether my parents imparted anything to me about being Chinese American, I would say no. I mean, they were immigrants. They were trying to figure out how to get by and put a house over our heads, and so that wasn't really part of our dinner conversation. In terms of my kids, I mean, I have a now 16-year-old and an 11-year-old, my nephew Elijah is here, and you know, I think that it's been a really special thing for them to see me write this book. I started this book during the pandemic when we were all home. Actually, a little anecdote about the writing process is we were all working from home, and the kids were taking school in Zoom. So when I signed the contract for this book in the summer of 2021, I was able to move my family to San Francisco for like 5-6 weeks, so that we rented an Airbnb here so I could work, take some vacation, and then in the afternoons I could go to the archives. And you know, my technique is I just photograph boxes of documents all over at historical societies, all over at Berkeley, at the Ethnic Studies Library, and all over you know, Gold Country, really, and also in Los Angeles at the Huntington and other archives down there. And they were able to see, and I was able to talk to them about, you know, this book. And it was Tuesday was the launch event for my book at the Museum of Chinese in America in New York, and it was an extraordinary event. And my 2 kids were able to be there, and it's you know, leading to, you know, wonderful conversations, and so the more that I think people can bring their kids to events like this, to come to CHSA, maybe there'll be documentaries, there'll be movies, like you know, and that's the opportunity to talk to them. One thing I'll say, because I'm worried about the next generation, is in terms of, because I've gotten this question a couple of times of like, what about the next generation? I think it would help if they read. I'm worried about the next generation and their screen time and their attention span and their ability to read a book like this. And so I would start with reading.
Michael, you've obviously done tremendous research. Congratulations on that. I'm wondering whether, I'm a former journalist myself, whether you, in getting to the why question of why there has been such a long history in this country of anti-Chinese feelings, was it racial, economic, combination of both, which more than the other? I'm curious what you found in that regard.
Yeah, no, I say, so yeah, like I actually asked that question from the beginning, like was it race, was it religion, was it economics? And I think the answer is it was all of those things. You know, it wasn't, you know, anyone who kind of explains this purely from a labor perspective and an economic perspective, I think is missing something. You know, on the other hand, there's no doubt that you know, that kind of that feeling of economic stagnation and stuckness that really that was going on in the 1870s was a really big part of the rise of the anti-Chinese movement. You know, like when we are, and you can talk about what's going on today, this kind of populist movement that's going on today, and we talk about what explains Trumpism and what's the sort of, you know, what's the, we have a colleague, Ben Wallace-Wells, a staffer at the New Yorker, he talked about what is the black box upstream from Trumpism. You know, I do think that, you know, there is this kind of feeling of, I just use the term stuckness, that has to do with like a feeling that this generation is not going to be as successful as the next, that there's this kind of, that leads to this kind of feeling of you need to smash the system. But race is definitely part of this movement, you know, and it's undeniable. And in the case of the Chinese, it was language, it was you know, racial difference, religion. I mean, one thing I'll just say is, one takeaway I have from this is, for human nature, difference is hard. You know, if you're in a, you know, I go to church, so if you're in a church, it's easier. Why are there not more multiracial churches? Because it's hard. Like, difference is hard. When you know, your friend groups, you think about your friend groups, it's most likely that you're going to be friends with like somebody who looks like you, has similar education, you know, has a similar sort of story, background. You know, that's why our diverse democracy is hard. It takes intentionality. It takes, you know, real effort. You know, I think the story of this book is actually an optimistic story, because it's a story about resilience, and it's a story about persistence. You know, when we're sitting here today, and you know, you know, there's great sort of pride and feeling in this room, but it's going to take intentional effort, you know, pushing that boulder up the hill. Elijah has a question?
This is just a quick question. As you said before, in 2016, I believe you said this is the hashtag. This is 2016.
Yeah.
Obviously, in the end, you got a more positive response, and you got to do all these panels and such. But when you first posted that, it kind of spiraled a bit. You did that more, I think you said. Was the media response more negative or positive?
Oh, well, I mean, I feel like the New York Times, my employer, it was a kind of remarkable series of events. Like, I posted this piece. I thought it was just going to be this little online-only thing. The next day, the editors of the newspaper decided to publish that open letter on the front page of the paper, which is an extraordinary decision because of the topic, because of the format. It was like this open letter. It was not a normal article. And then what we ended up doing was we asked Asian Americans to send in videos direct to camera of their own experiences of being told to go back to their country. And it led to this kind of its own sort of viral sort of thing where people were just sharing their stories of their experiences with this. It was such a viral thing. I mean, I don't know how many people here really remember this, but I was at a Barnes & Noble's with my daughter, and somebody looked at me and walked over to me and said, "Are you Michael Luo?" And because she had seen me in that video. And so yes. So I would say that, I mean, I don't know. This is the kind of story that I think people in the media, it's an easy thing to kind of show, you know, your kind of bona fides to, like, you know, invite me on to, you know, to talk about these things. I mean, I think the larger, more difficult thing is to include these stories, you know, more regularly as part of, you know, coverage, and to tell stories of Asian Americans, you know, and see those kind of not kind of you know, set aside in its own little special month or, you know, a section of the bookstore, but really just kind of part of, you know, coverage of, you know, American society and culture.
Was there a question? Yeah.
All right.
Okay, here.
When did you finish writing this book?
So the way it works in publishing is, I guess I turned in the draft probably about a year ago. Publishing takes a long time, and so yeah, I finished about a year ago. You like, one just little anecdote is, I didn't take time off to write this book, and so I worked on it from 5:30 to 7:30 in the morning. You know, before my family got up, and then on weekends. I mean, just a little personal anecdote is that both of my girls play basketball, and they had practices, 2-hour practices on the west side of Manhattan. So I bring one daughter to practice, sit in a coffee shop for 2 hours, bring her back, bring the other daughter over, 2 hours in the coffee shop, bring her back. That is 8 hours every weekend. And I don't know if there are writers out there, journalists out there who are looking for kind of tips for productivity. You know, there's some people talk about when you write a book, you got to write 1,000 words a day. I couldn't do that because I had a full-time job, but I could write 200 words a day, and so that means in a week I could write 1,000 words. And if you kind of did the math, that's how it works out to this book.
All right, I have a question for my brother.
This is my identical twin brother, Chris, the biggest cheerleader of the book.
So ever since we were little, we were always an extraordinary writer. And I think one thing I remember when you talk about reading, when we were really young, I think it was maybe 4th grade, my brother here read a book called Roots by Alex Haley.
I think it was like
Has
second.
anyone read that book? Okay, I attempted to read it when he said he read it.
I think it was 2nd grade, but yeah.
So, I mean, obviously it tells an epic story of the roots of Alex Haley.
Yeah.
And I was just thinking about that, and it kind of is similar in what you're attempting to do. And I don't know, have you ever thought about that parallel? Because I always trace back his writing and to this reading of this epic story from when we were.
Chris told this story at my in his best man toast at our wedding. It was like because he was reading Hardy Boys, and then one day I came home. I said, "Chris, you got to read this book. It's about this guy Kunta Kinte." I mean, that's an amazing full circle question. The thing that I compared this book to from the beginning was The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson. When I pitched the book, I said that I wanted to do for Chinese migration what Isabel Wilkerson did to write the story about the Great Migration. Isabel Wilkerson interviewed 900 people who remembered the Great Migration. I was not able to do that because this history is, goes back further. The archives are harder, but I was able to, interview, actually one fun experiment. I'm kind of curious. How many people in this room can trace their families back to the 19th century? Chinese families can trace their back to the 19th century. Yeah. I mean, that's a remarkable thing. I originally thought that I might be able to kind of do what Isabel Wilkerson did, which is build it around 2 or 3 families. And that just was too hard. Connie Young Yu is here, sitting up here, and she's like this giant in the community. You should all give her a round of applause because she did this work going back decades, and her story, her family's story, is in the book, and the oral histories that she has helped collect have been a big part of telling this book. And so, the Alex Haley told the story of his family, through all the way back, going back, and I wasn't able to do that, to tell the story of one central family or several central families, but what I thought of the book as was, I came to think of the book as the Chinese people as a whole, as a collective, were the protagonists of this book, and I think that it's them that you're following through the narrative.
There's just time for one more question.
Okay.
Yes, a question about Tacoma.
Yeah.
In 1993, there was a resolution passed by the city that says the 1885 riot was the most reprehensive
Yeah.
occurrence.
Yeah.
How did that come about?
I actually have not, I don't exactly know the Tacoma story. I know there's a park there that memorializes that at this point. What I am more familiar with is, you know, because people have asked about, you know, modern day kind of developments, and you know, after the pandemic, there was kind of this surge of, you know, cities that apologized, you know, for their actions, you know, in the 19th century, and there was this, and there's also a movement to memorialize some of these things that have really kind of started to accelerate. So in Los Angeles, you know, there is currently just a little plaque that marks the massacre site, and now they've approved a design for this, you know, beautiful, elaborate memorial, and they're raising money to erect it. And you know, I wrote about the Rock Springs massacre, which is where 28 Chinese miners were killed, and the Chinese Quarter was burned down in Rock Springs, Wyoming, and there's a statue going up, you know, this summer there. You know, Eureka, California, which is one of the where the driving out began. There's an effort now to kind of have a more elaborate kind of memorial there. So there, I think the pandemic did lead to a reckoning in a lot of different places. I just feel like you know, there was kind of an ebbing of that kind of energy, and you know, this book is a product of that energy, and I just hope that it's part of, you know, telling the story going forward.
Mike is going to be signing books after this, I think up there, and Strangers of the Land, if you guys haven't picked up a copy, you can pick one up back there and he will sign it. And congratulations, and thank you everyone for coming out.
Thank you.
It's good.
Great job. I was probably too long-winded.
No, it's great.
Thank you for doing this.
My pleasure.
There.
Yeah.